actually put in the eyes, we're going to put a scalp line on this face so that when we put hair on it, this will be ready. So now we have drawn a line. Now we're going to cut around that, on that line. I learned this technique from the American Indians. When they scalped people, they had to only cut down to the bone. They didn't have to cut any deeper to peel off the scalp. This scalp is only 1 millimeter thick, so we have to make sure maybe 1.5 millimeters. Doesn't go any deeper than that. Of course we can't because we have this bone skull underneath the clay, don't we? So it's a moot question. It'll all work out. The thing I don't want to do is to cut into the ears. Alright, now we're going to gently excise a layer of material out between our cuts. Now we don't need to take it all the way off the skull completely, but we do need to taper it down to those cut lines. So we don't take it off here, but we do take it off millimeter deep here, or anywhere near the cut line. Finish this off and you can start again. Now all we're doing is removing material, trying to make it even. This little tool has tiny teeth, like a sculptor's chisel. And you can see the mark it makes. See that little claw teeth on this, like a sculptor's chisel? It's a great tool for removing small amounts of material when you're very tight space. All I'm doing is working on the area where the hair-covered scalp will be glued on. It isn't totally balanced. That's not the end of the world either, but I'll just make it balanced. You can't come down too low on the forehead with your scalp. Well, you don't want to come over the eyes, but any lower than this, because you can pluck the hair away from the edge of the scalp, make a hairline whatever you want, but you can't add the hair. Once it's on, the hair is going to be only so deep, and that's it. And you do not want to make your join here at the hairline itself. It's hard to cover the hairline that way. You'll see when we put the hair on. So I think we're ready now for the next step. Here's our finished or completed modeled head. We're ready now to put some hair on his head. We've cut the step down to place the scalp around the head, and all the features are more or less as far as we're going to go with it. The eyes, the ears, everything's ready. The first thing we need to do this, of course, is a scalp of hair. Now this is a piece of sheepskin cut from the hide of the sheep with the hair as it grows naturally out of it. It's a lot of hair here. We're going to reduce this way down. To do this, we have to comb out the hair. It's a tedious process, but it has to be done. And you take your time to do it. Listen to interesting tapes or the radio or watch television, although I'd keep my eyes on what I was doing if I were you. But gradually you comb it out. And you're going to comb out at least half of the hair. Here's what I've combed out of what I'm going to show you. This all has to come out. It takes time. You can't do it quickly. And you have to do it carefully so as not to tear the flesh of the skin. If you tear it, you've ruined what you're doing. First thing I do with a male head is to cut off all the excess hair. You can cut it off to within 2 inches of the scalp and not ruin your end result, because in the scale of it, this is maybe a foot of hair. But you cut it all off with the scissors. Just start chopping all the hair all the way around. You haven't put your pattern on yet. This is still without the pattern of the scalp. See, it's blank. But we're going to reduce this to this. Now this has been combed and combed and combed. And a lot of hairs come out of it. As I say, all this hair has come out of what we're doing. And you keep combing. A very good way when you're getting ready to finish getting rid of hair is to begin pulling it out with a good pair of tweezers. You see, these are not pointed sharp. They have a blunt end to them, and they have a good grip in here. They're well made. And you simply lightly pinch your hair down as close as you can get to the scalp and begin drawing it out. What you're doing is getting rid of the nappy. You see these little fine hairs? I'm going to draw some more, because you keep doing this. Now you get a few guard hairs, but most of it's nappy, the little tiny fuzzy frizzy hairs. You want to get as much of that out as you can. Unfortunately, it's dense and it's close to the scalp, so it requires just doing what I'm doing. And it does take hours. You don't do this in 10 minutes. But it comes out, and being very careful not to tear the scalp when you do it. You have to resist just enough to draw some hairs out, not jerk out something that is resisting you and doesn't want to come. The nappy comes out fairly easily. The guard hairs not so easily. The fewer guard hairs you draw forward, the better it's going to look. It's a long process. This is nearly finished. Well, the next thing you need is your pattern. This is a scalp pattern. Again, it's a generic scalp pattern. Fits all heads of this general size. I take this and I cut a piece of canvas or cloth the same as the paper pattern. Then I take the cloth pattern and I place it over the skull that I'm working on and see how far it goes, where it needs to be increased, where it needs to be taken in. And you see it needs to be taken, we need to extend it down the back, we need to extend it down the sideburns. All of this is taken into consideration when we redraw it on the back of the skin itself. Here's our plate of hair. Turn it over. We draw around with the paper pattern. It's easy to draw around the paper than it is the cloth one. And then make the extensions. We draw around the paper pattern, and then we make the extensions we need. Now we have to go down the sideburns. We have to eliminate some in here, so to extend that out a bit, and we need to come down to the end of the skin in the back. Once this is cut free along these lines, we will sew up the gussets or whatever they're called here. To cut the hair and the scalp part, you want to use blunt nose scissors so that you don't prick into the skin and so that you can go along underneath the hairs close to the skin. The idea is to go as close, see how I'm dipping down and pushing against the skin. You don't want to go up in the air this way. Going up in the air, you're cutting a lot of hair. You don't want to cut the hairs if you can avoid it. So you go underneath the skin and push along the bottom. I'm pushing along this line from the bottom, underneath, and cutting the After you've done this once or twice, you will learn to manipulate your instrument so as not to damage and leave a fringe of sticky outy stubble along the edge. That's especially critical across the forehead. All right, now we've cut the design of the scalp. Now we're going to sew up these divisions here. And I use just cotton thread number 50, sewing thread, and a reasonably fine needle. It is not easy to sew any kind of a animal skin. You want to go into the skin at least 1.5 millimeters with your stitches, otherwise they might pull out. And just whipping down the edge of the opening is all we're doing. Eventually all of this will be glued to the skull and will hold in place with the cement. It doesn't require the stitches. But the stitches are essential for the original modeling of the scalp. It's like a little cap we're making. Now don't go all the way to the edge. I stop maybe 1/8 of an inch in, because if we have to trim this edge or adjust it in some way, we don't want to cut into our stitches if we can help it. If it does come to that, you just sew it up again. I'm going to leave at least 1/4 of an inch open on this, because we're going down the sideburns a bit. And we're going to have to trim it around the ear. Animal skin, human skin or animal skin, the same thing. Very tough. If you've ever tried to sew up your children's wounds or whatever it is, you realize how rubbery and difficult it is to get the skin to go through the needle. One more to go. Now we've done all the sewing we are going to do in this. At least you'd like to believe we are done with the sewing. And now we have the beginnings of the cap. Now it's not going to just plop over and fit tight down over the skull. It has to be worked with moisture and with your fingers and with modeling and taking more gussets out. This is the beginning. You see, we're going to have to take more out here. This all evolves as you go along. It isn't something that can be snapped together like a silly plastic toy. And the nice thing about actual animal or human skin is that once it's moist, it stretches. So this will help us model around the skull. So this is why we're going to moisten it now. So here's our basin of water. Here's the brush. And we're simply going to brush water inside the skin here. Get started. We're not wetting the hair side. It's not necessary. You can turn it inside out. That's easier to handle even. And we're going to manipulate it, massage it, get that water into the skin, get the skin loosened up a little bit. See how it's getting nice and pliable and sculptural. Now we're going to try again with the skull and see where it needs adjusting. The main thing is to get it across the forehead evenly so that both sides come down the same distance on the sideburn. We want to bring it down to our step position. See how it begins to mold against the skull? Now we'll work back from that and see where we are. Go to the very back now. Bring the hair down to the nape of the neck and see how much we have far to go. That's pretty close. Close enough. But now we're going to have to take out some hair and some skin and hair in here. We've already stitched it. We're going to have to restitch that. That's all right. It's part of the game. Around the ears. It's just too much in there. This side, interestingly enough, isn't so bulky. A little bit has to come out, but not a lot. Hard to see when I'm doing it, but still in all, when you do it yourself, you'll figure it out. The idea is to fit the scalp to the head. That should be enough. Okay. All right, now we've turned it inside out, and we're going to tailor this a little more. Take out some and restitch it. It should be evident to everyone that it's easier to fit a scalp that's tight than one that's loose, because if it's loose you have to get rid of all the floppy edges that are too much material. But with a tight one, because it's wet and flexible and pliable, rubbery, it will stretch, and that's good. The ideal for this is to have a scalp that's just tight enough to stretch carefully over the skull without tearing. It does want to cover all the area that you want to cover, however. It has to go down to the step that we cut into the skull itself to accommodate the thickness of this scalp material. Now we're going to do the other one. It's a good idea to comb it out a little bit first, get rid of the loose hairs. Always loose hairs when you cut anything. You just don't want a lot of loose hairs, because that means you've done a bad cut. Someday somebody will manufacture a synthetic plush that will be so fine in its base that it'll look like skin, and all the synthetic hair will stand up out of it somehow. To me it'll be magic, and you'll get away from the animal skin. Animal skin is beautiful if you do it with some degree of skill, but it is subject to what the insurance people refer to as inherent vice, beetles and so on. You have to maintain a sculpture employing any kind of animal part, feathers, skin, fur, something that most sculptors that I've encountered don't even think about. They want to use these materials, but they don't think about the future for them. The future has to be one of protection. You have to design your piece that can be restored or conserved, and you have to be aware that these things can happen. If you sell your end product for many thousands of dollars, the patron's going to be furious with you and want his money back if 6 months later he finds beetles are chewing holes in it. So you have to think about these things. there's ways to prevent it. We had a conservation program in our last seminar that was supposed to take care of some of those questions. Somebody will be with us this time that can answer those questions if they come up. Another little combing of the thing before we turn it inside out again, see how much better we hope it will fit. I'm going to even up the back just slightly. Now let's turn it inside out. To add more water. My fingers are drying it out. It's nice to work with wet leather, but it does dry out in a hurry. Now let's try it over our man's head and see if it comes anywhere near where we want it. Pulling the sideburns down. Sideburn on that side is better than one on this side, so we've got too much on one, not enough on the other. There we go. Now they're both meeting where they should at the bottom of the sideburn. Hope you can see that. And going across the forehead. He will not have a low forehead. I'll show you what happens. His forehead will be raised, but differently from what you see. And pull it down in the back. And you notice I'm pulling on the hair, but I'm not going to pull it out of the scalp. I'm also pulling on the scalp itself. We could lose a little bit of the entire body of the thing right along here. It needs to be cut away, and right along here it needs to be cut away. So we're going to trim it out, take it off again. It's off and on. It's like dressmaking or something. You have to keep whittling away at it till it's right. Notice I'm pulling the hair away from the edge, pulling it up so that I don't cut off the hairs high on the hair. I want it right down at the scalp where I'm cutting it. See, there's a little bit of hair that I've cut free. That's all right. It's going to stay there. And if I cut off the scalp, it's going to go. Same thing on this side. I'm pulling the hair away from the edge, back up into the body of the piece. I'm going to cut just a little bit off here.
Let's see if this comes closer to
the piece, the shape of the thing we want. All right, see now that comes, see the step? Here's the edge of the scalp. We want that to come over to that step. It does there. Still a little bit too much on this side. I'm pushing down with my thumbnail along the groove of the step through the skin. It's going to leave a mark on the inside. See the little groove it made? Well, we're going to cut that away. I think we're pretty close to there on the scalp. The next step would be to glue it into place. Here's an example of what I meant about when you're trimming underneath, catching hairs. Now we've lost some hair here. As a matter of fact, it's not going to be a bad thing because it's a little too down, it's down too far over our step. So we do need to cut a little bit of the skin away. And afterwards we're going to depilate some of the forehead so he won't have such a low forehead. That'll balance out what we're doing here. It would be nice if these heads, plastered and clay heads, were something you could stick a pin in to hold the thing in place. Well, you can jam a pin in, but it's not altogether secure. The plaster does not yield to pins. I'm going to use a pair of specially made pliers that I use for a lot of things to gently pull this down. We don't want to do it very hard or we tear it. The worst thing that can happen now is we tear the skin. But I've taken enough of a bite. See, I'm not just doing it right at the edge. I'm going right up into the hair and pulling it down. Because it's damp, it stretches. See how it came right down to the edge where we wanted it. Here's our scalp ready to receive the glue. Here's the brush we're going to use. Here is the white glue. We're just going to pour some in the bottom of our cap of hair and brush it up to the edges, trying not to get it over the edge and into the hair. Obviously, we don't want it in the hair. And it's also a good idea to make sure to have a complete contact of the glued surface here and the skull itself. So we're going to put a little bit of glue around the places we want the hair to glue down to, just to make certain. It's especially critical around the very border, the edge of it, that little step have glue in it. It's hard to add it once the whole messy business is in place, because you have to contend with the hair all the time. And the glue will stay tacky for a few minutes, but not much longer. And I think we have most of it covered. So now we're going to go in and put the scalp on as briskly as we can, pressing it down into those sideburn areas, because that's where we have to start. We have to start at the front and then press the forehead down. The wet skin, the damp skin, and the glue are compressing the scalp skin, so it will go down into this space we're trying to put it in. You sort of feel your way along. This is not an exact science, as I say over and over, for those of you who think you have to do everything by numbers. There's no set formula for any of it. You have to figure it out as you go. All of this is simply an experiment which has evolved over a half century. Good, bad, or indifferent, this is what it is. I don't recommend it to anybody. If you want to do it this way, wonderful. If you evolve your own and superior way of doing it, all the better. That's what makes you an artist. The nice thing about doing anything with this is your life doesn't depend on it. Nothing does. There should be give you some creative pleasure, or don't do it. It looks like his scalp is fairly well placed, and the cement is doing what it's supposed to do. This is not quick drying cement. We'll leave it now for many hours before we ever play with it again. After it's theoretically dried in place, we're going to have to doctor up some of these edges with our tool and make sure that the edges are firmly down and on the same level as the clay. The clay and the skin and hair have to be the same. There can't be a bump there. You can do a little doctoring now while it's still damp. The clay, fortunately, being water-based, when the moisture reaches it, begins to become a little bit flexible, so you can use pressure and try to adjust the two edges. Our forehead is the most visible and hardest to cover area, so we want this to be as smooth as possible in the eventuality when we're done. We're not done. We're just getting started on this. As long as the hair is in place where it's supposed to be, we're set for the rest of it. And it seems to be more or less ready. So we're going to put this aside and let him dry. Virtually ready to start covering the face with skin now, color. But before we do that, and it's done with an airbrush, before we do any airbrushing, we have to mask all the hair so the airbrush paint doesn't go into it. And to do that, we're going to use this typical blue tape to mask the hair. Get all the hair away from the clay that we can. I prefer this blue tape, although it doesn't have much of a bond to the, I don't know what it's called, Scotch tape that is for masking and sticking things down, because that has a very heavy adhesive and you'll tear the hair out when you're trying to get rid of it again. You don't want to do that. Getting away with it? No. One thing I learned about masking the hair was that later on, when you take all this blue stuff off, paint will come right up to the edge of it, and we don't want a hard edge of a joint. So I always pry a little bit of the base along the hairline so the paint will go up into the hair just slightly. This helps to blend the join between the hair and the clay, which will be painted. The clay will be painted, not the hair, just so it doesn't stick down to the clay itself. See that little space under there? Right. There's a little bit of hair showing. That we can rub off later on. The paint will rub out of it. Now we've got most of the masking done. One thing we do want to mask in addition is the eyeballs. And this is just regular Vaseline and a small brush. And we're going to go in and paint just the glass part of the eyeball with a thin film. The same would be true if you had teeth showing. That's all there is to that. The coloring agent that we're going to use is a mixture. It's not a pre-prepared paint, as it were. The binder or the base is Liquitex matte medium, which I guess is an acrylic. Yes, it says acrylic. But the pigments to color it are dry pigments, and I've always used dry pigments. They're very dear, especially the red ones, but this is the way it's done as far as I taught myself to do it. And the white, which is the basis of the color, is titanium. And we put several scoops of that in the mixing bowl. I also use a matting agent or powder, which is, photographers use it, I don't know what for, but just a little bit. And I also use talc, not baby powder, but talc, a quantity of that. And in addition, we use a wetting agent, just a few drops. This helps to bring all the pigments and everything when you add your Liquitex. And of course, a good artist does not mix his colors with the same tool without wiping it. And we're going to use some cadmium red, ochre. Skins are all manner of colors, a bit of blue, ultramarine blue, or just a touch of that. This will help to gray it down. And we'll see if we want to add this umber later on, but we're going to start with this. See how far we go. Just going to mix it here for a minute and see. We'll do our mixing in this with a brush actually, but just to get started and see what seems to be happening. All of this has to be strained, which I will show you in a moment. You don't put anything like this through an airbrush easily. It's a little bit dark, a little bit light. I think we need some more. Let's see what happens when we put the burnt sienna in it. These inexpensive glue brushes have nice stiff bristles, and I like them for mixing the dry paint. It helps to break apart the particles of paint. It's gone from being a Norwegian to a North African in one swell swoop. So we're going to have to add a little more white. And the ochre there's a lot of green in our skin colors if we're Caucasian, European types. So the ochre and the blue help to produce that. It won't be a disaster if our first layer of skin is too dark. It probably isn't too dark, but it will darken some with moisture, so we'll see what happens when we add I'm going to add a little more of this wetting agent just to make sure that it's effective. Now we're going to put in the Liquitex. And mix it with our brush. Always little particles of cadmium that, if they're not carefully crushed in this process, or if they go through the strainer for some reason, they become tiny specks of red on the skin surface. If that were even, and there were tiny specks of every color on the skin surface, it would be very effective. Your eye couldn't tell the difference. It would blend beautifully, but that isn't the way it works. It looks like they have acne. So you have to be careful about mixing it as much as you can. I'm no master colorist, but I work for what I can get. I think just a little bit more blue is in order. Just a touch. I don't know if we'll be able to see that. Here again, if the blue doesn't get thoroughly mixed, it appears on the skin too. It goes right through the airbrush in tiny little particles, and it blooms. Blue is, well, any of these colors will bloom on the surface if they're not diluted in this process right away. You see any difference? I can't. It should gray it down some. We could try that and see. Now, this will not go through the airbrush. It's too viscous. So we're going to add a little bit of distilled water to thin it down enough to go through the airbrush. That should do it. Now we have to... This is simply a fine mesh plated, nickel-plated screen. And we're going to put it through that. The jar that it's pouring into will be fastened to the airbrush. Has a slight violet cast, make him look like he had a liver disease. Just going to stir this slightly in the strainer. A little bit of lump in the center is unstrained talc. Talc provides little tiny flakes. Well, talc is a mineral and it is flakes. And these flakes break up the surface of the skin, allowing light to go in and out through the skin somewhat. That's the purpose of that, so it doesn't look like it's a painted surface so much. Now we're ready to apply the lid on that. Now we're going to go in to the spray room and see what happens with the airbrush. Once I've sprayed it, I've sprayed it. Here we are now, just before our next coat of airbrush goes on, and we need to do some detailing on the face to bring up some of the details of the mouth and the eye, brows and such, and maybe heighten the color a bit. So we have our pigments set out, we have a bit of our base color that's already on here, and some dry pigments, and we're going to have to mix those, and we need to use our Liquitex base, so I put a few drops of that out. First thing we want to touch up is the brow area where the leather and the clay meet. It's always a tricky area. And then we want to give a little color to the nose and the cheeks, a little more than it has, because when we spray this again with the airbrush, we'll lose most of our added on color that we're doing right now. We have to go back after we've done that next coat, the last coat, maybe the next to the last coat, and bring these up once more. Each time we spray with the airbrush, we flatten out all the color. We're not going to take them out entirely because we're not going to make a heavy coat of airbrush paint. The other area that needs to be addressed is area of the beard. Bring that up a bit. And then we'll try to put the airbrush coat on just enough so that it mutes what we're doing and seems to blend it. The idea is to make it look blended. The benefit, if there's any to the airbrush, is that it gives a blending coat, little spicules of paint. Unlike a brushed on color, which is what you're seeing now, little spicules of paint cause things to blend. That's why the airbrush was an asset to commercial art, is its ability to make things blend one shade to another and so on so beautifully. Much too difficult for most brushwork. Most flesh around the average eye is a little paler than the rest of the face. And another difficulty with painted colors and textures and so on is, if you're doing a face anyway, that's our focus, is that it's very difficult to get both sides exactly alike. You don't want one cheek bluer than the other. In this case, we're doing the beard, shaved beard. Let's see what we can do with the eyebrow. He had a heavy, dark eyebrow, according to the photograph, and I never use black if I can avoid it, except around the pupil of the eye. But since these are glass eyes, we don't have to worry about that. But his black brows are not going to be painted with black anything. We use a mixture of raw umber and ultramarine blue, which gives a very nice, dark, almost black look when it's done properly. Nothing like a little saliva to make things go. Don't worry, a lot of this is going to disappear when we get that second coat of airbrush on there. This is more like a wash of color than anything else. And later on, when we take our masking paper off and clean up the border of the hair, get all the paint out of it, we can put a little bit more color at the edge of the hairline than we can do right now. A little darker color just to help blend the two together. We don't want to give him too pink a lip, but we need to bring up some of this color because we're going to wash it out again. Remember, the nose is very colorful on almost all faces, men and women. In today's movies, where a very light makeup is used, you'll see these shiny red noses on our most beautiful women. I don't think they're very attractive, but that's the fashion, and that's nature. Let's enhance that line around the lips a little bit, making sure that our brush is free of foreign bodies, which it seems not to be at the moment. In the most perfect of all worlds, this little line I'm trying to put on would be a contour in the sculpture. It was intended to be that way when I started out, but over the period of our work here, it has more or less vanished, and now we're going to have to try to reintroduce it with a bit of color. On one side it worked well, but we don't want it to be too lopsided. It's marvelous how the paint sticks to my skin. It doesn't stick to the sculpture worth a darn. It'll take me half an hour to wash that off. Well, we're getting a little bit picky here now because our next coat of airbrush will, as I say, eliminate a lot of this. So I think this is as far as we'll go with our handwork at the moment. Well, now we're ready for our next layer of airbrush color, and it's only going to be a light mist. We're not going to try to cover everything solid. So we're going to make a few test sprays in the atmosphere and then come in just like that. Whoops. Sometimes it spits at us, and it did today. So we have our brush handy to stop it from doing that. Well, we hope that won't show too badly. I think that's where we should stop before we take out any more. We go back now and do some more detailing. Well, now we've had probably our last airbrush layer, and we need again to pick up some of the colors. I'm going to use just a touch of matting in our base color to make sure that the forehead isn't shiny. This is tricky because the matting, sometimes the matting material, I don't know what the chemistry of it is, sometimes creates little tiles of fluid, so you have to make sure you're not doing too much with it. That's about all there is to that. Now the eyebrows have gone away again, so we're going to go back to our raw umber and ultramarine blue and some of our Liquitex, a bit of ochre. Try to get that color dark without, yeah, that's good. It's always easy to do this eyebrow with a left-handed stroke. This one isn't as easy to make go where you want it. I do a great deal of my work with my right hand, but painting and drawing and writing I have to use my left hand, which probably makes me left-handed dominant. I don't know. Sure, I can't do much with the left hand except this. Here again is this business of trying to make both sides identical. I don't succeed particularly, but we want them to be believable even if they're not identical. And while we still have it a bit liquid, we can try with one of our sharper tools to do a little bit of scoring in there. Yes, I know it's going through the base color, but we're going to go back over that when it firms up a bit. try to avoid crimson. I stay with scarlet. Scarlet has orange in it, crimson has blue in it. And crimson always seemed to me to rather be a bilious color. But scarlet has, to me, more life and believability, if there is such a thing in a color. And somewhere in my training as a portrait painter, I was told that the upper lip is generally painted a shade darker than the lower lip. I don't know if this is some antique tradition or whatever. Anyway, it seemed to be, for the person teaching me, to be the correct way to do it. And in the portraits I examined, of course the portrait painters I examined were masters. My eye may not have been sharp enough to detect the difference, but it did look as if it was slightly darker. The edge of the lower lip, the bottom edge, there's usually a little more color than on the top of the lip, this edge here. So I'm pretending that I know what I'm doing. I'm going to give it a touch of color change, just enough so that I'm going to of health. And our favorite place, the nose. Nothing like a big red nose to add character. I think we should leave it at that. Everybody who is a good sculptor and a good painter knows what to do. They don't need lessons from me. Anyway, that's the way we get started with the coloring of the face. Now the next step is, of course, to remove this masking from the hair. We have quite a way to go here because there's a lot of cleanup to do. One has to be careful in removing this because it now, even though it was difficult to make stick when we put it on, it's now quite sticky. It had overnight to decide to be contrary, you see. So now we have to be careful we don't pull the hair loose from the scalp itself, loose from the skull by yanking on this. We just gently ease this off. Almost there. Now you see we have this area around the head here that we need to treat. So I brought out some brushes with stiff bristles, and we have a little water handy, and we're just going to comb up into the hair a little bit, see if we can get some of this loosened up. I don't advise using any kind of a soap because even though the paint seems to stick to my skin, it probably won't stick to this if we get soap in it to cut this paint in the hairline. It's coming loose. I mean, the paint is coming out. You just have to work on it till it does. You have to go all the way around. The forehead and front are the most critical areas because that usually shows more than the rest of the head, obviously. And we want to make certain that we have as little damage to the sculpture as possible here. But we do have to free up these roots of the hair from the paint. Well, now we always want to check our model, and you will see that once the hair has been released from the mastic, and most of the edge of it treated, getting the paint out, that it's pretty wild compared to the model. But that part of dressing the hair, we're not going to go into. That can be done by adding varnish and putting it into shapes that hold it down overnight or through an oven-controlled heat, light heat, to keep the hair in place. And once it's been heated treatment that way, then it'll go back into this shape. But we're not going to deal with that part. It's been more or less cut to the length, but not barbered yet. So the hair is on and the hairline is done, and the part and the rest of it. Now we're going to clear the eyes of the material on the eyeball, which we've left there to the last minute. This comes right off the eyeball because of the Vaseline, as you remember. If it hadn't been Vaseline covered, why, it would be much harder to get off and a lot more pressure and the likelihood of messing up the eyelids and so on, getting it off. But it's going to come off, as it should, in good time. There's one little thing we can do with the corner of the eye, which we've mentioned before, that little spot of red that is typical of the corner of the eye. Let's see if we can get that on without overstating it. I think that's a little much, but I'll have to leave it at that. I'm going to add a little bit of material to the corner of his right eye, because I think just to bring it down a little bit into the shape of the other eye. Just a touch. the next step in this process, aside from making the hair do what I just described, we need to do eventually, is to put on the eyelashes. This has been demonstrated elsewhere, but we're going to do it here again, so we'll set up for that. As before, we have our strip of organza, which has been dyed a dark brown. For the eyelashes, we're going to shorten it, and then we're going to pluck out the fibers. See the fibers coming out. So now we've finished with our plucking the fibers free, and we're going to cut 2 pieces appropriate to the eye length, saving one for the Cyclops. And now we're going to paint a little cement in there along the top of the eyelid. Most of the difficulty with making anything this scale is holding the material, or figuring out a way to hold it. That's the biggest challenge I always have. I know it can be done, it's just how to do it. Remember, the inside of the eyelid is tipped back up against the eyeball. It isn't just flush down to it, so that the eyelash can be placed on a slight angle in there, making the eyelashes come down rather than straight out at you. I don't know if you can see that in the picture. I warned you about not sneezing or coughing. If the phone rings during these operations, you ignore it. If they really want to get to you, they'll find you eventually. Nothing is as important as your work. Now you notice we've got little daubs on the eyeball. That's easy to take care of. Once that's set up and hard, we just scrape it off. It'll come off as easily as the paint did. And we're not going to fiddle with that anymore. We'll let it stay that way until it dries. Another little thing I discovered is that if you disturb the surface of the skin, if it seems a little bit shiny or there are a little too many areas where it looks painted or something, you just disturb it a little bit with a sharp edge, and this breaks up the light and helps to blend things. And there's no science to this, it just seems to be the case. You want to make sure that your lip parting always has an actual division, that the paint, spray, and brush paint haven't filled it up. And I used to put pores on the sides of men's noses because there were such things. But that may be going a bit far. I used to do the same thing for the shaved cheek, the lip or something, just giving it a little bit of little tiny indentations. Because everywhere there's a hair follicle, there's a tiny indentation. I don't know if you can see any of this. It's just a little fillip of unnecessary activity. The main thing that always concerned me is that the finish on the faces and the hands, whatever the skin is exposed, doesn't look painted. And I learned by observation that the human flesh, anything but smooth, except when one's an infant. The older we get, the rougher our skin texture is. And one place that, even on a youthful face like this, where there's any kind of roughness, if you want to call it that, is where the beard has been shaved away. And you can go all over it, all the way to the ears to do that. Just a suggestion in front. I think we've gone as far as we want to on this. I've been alerted to the fact that this gentleman does not part his hair in the center, and just for the sake of consistency, we'll move the part over a little bit. Probably too far, but anyway. And eventually we'll get the hair in place, but that's enough on this.